Hi, everybody. Let's see if I can scroll down and find out who everybody is. Well, my daughter Devora is here. Hi, honey. Barbara Reed is here. Hello to you too, Barbara. And Stephen Wolfbrand is here. Hi, Steve. Nice to see you. It may be also that others have arrived as well. Please share, like, and subscribe when this video goes up in the YouTube version, about 20 minutes or so after we're done here. And please do occasionally come to my Patreon page, which is at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Also, please let me know if my sound is okay. I'm hoping it is. Hoping you can see me okay. My software is telling me that I'm using close to 100% of my CPU, and when that happens, it usually means everything is lagging somewhat. Hopefully, you're seeing my face again, so that's good. And we also have a quorum here, according to my indicator. So I think we can get down to business. So I've been meaning to cover an article that appeared in New Economic Perspectives, I should say, which I used to do a lot of writing for. And this is a post there by J.D. By J.D. Alt. And J.D. I thought that J.D. did a very, very good post. Well, thanks, honey. So Bonnie came in and helped me by turning off the overhead light. You should be seeing that in just a minute after the delay goes away. You wrote a very good post, and it was called The People's Money, Part 4. And it's about inflation and consumption, and also about looking back from the year 2030, which is what suggested the title of my live stream tonight. So I want to go over this post with you. Discuss it at some length. Then I might go to an old post of mine written back in 2010 in order to provide a little perspective on this. Since this particular post appeared, I've been waiting for JD to come out with part 5. That hasn't happened yet, but I'm looking forward to it with some anticipation. I expect it to be another very, very good post and well worth reading. Anyway, here we are at inflation and consumption. JD says, let's quickly recap. I outlined in part three an argument that modern society has evolved in ways that actually necessitates a dramatic increase in public enterprise. Yet at the same time, we've doubled down on an old world. We've doubled down on an old world narrative concerning money that makes it mathematically impossible to meet that need. Oh, by the way, I'll show the post on my screen now so you can see it too. There we go. You should be getting that in just a minute. In parts one and two, JD says, we reconfirmed a modern money perspective by simply observing the actual operations of the Federal Reserve, and reconfirmed as well how this new perspective holds out the opportunity to actually confront, through the efforts of public enterprise, the new challenges that our modern society faces. Now, this may have some echoes for you because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez gave a speech at the Los Angeles rally on Saturday, where she talked about the need to build an advanced society. And she pointed out that our society did not measure up to what we need uh, to have in an advanced society. She talked about the need for further development, among other things. Whether we're going to call a new society an advanced society or not, whether that will become the term of art, the meme, that we use to refer to the outcome of the Green New Deal, actually remains to be seen. I think it's a somewhat attractive term, and I think that it has some relevance to what JD is talking about here. So let's go further. It was my intention at this point to focus on the unfolding reality that climate change will soon prove to be the most dramatic challenge that modern society is facing, and will be the challenge that actually necessitates by far the greatest need for goods and services produced by public enterprise, and he emphasizes the public there. More to the point, JD continues, climate change will generate the greatest need by far for implementing and managing a quote modern money unquote perspective in America's economy. While I still intend to pursue this argument, comments addressed to part three have led me to change sequence. I realize now it will be ineffective and perhaps futile to discuss the extraordinary level of public spending that climate change is going to necessitate without first attempting to address two related issues. One, The stridently insistent warnings about inflation, quote unquote, and but two, the conundrum of the necessity for increased, quote, consumption, unquote. I'll begin this effort with a simple premise. It is willfully self-harming to confront the collective need for which the labor and material are available to provide a remedy, but refuse to employ the labor and the material by arguing that doing so will create an imbalance in the monetary system. This, for all practical purposes, is precisely what is being argued when direct sovereign spending is withheld from our public enterprise out of fear of inflation. At that precise point, it seems to me, the tail begins wagging the dog, and there is very little concern for the dog itself. So, who's the dog? I think we, the people, are the dog, right? Looking back from the year 2030 to visualize the issue, let's imagine ourselves a decade hence and all the money intensive challenges we've earlier outlined, supported by our modern money perspective, have largely been met by the efforts of public enterprise. It's the year 2030, and millions of Americans who previously struggled to get available health care can now walk into any doctor's office, neighborhood clinic, or hospital emergency room with a universal coverage card. And millions of recent college graduates have seen their old tuition debts canceled, and every high school grad can now pursue higher education or technical training debt-free. And millions of children are now entering grade school, having been fully nurtured and prepared during their preschool years to engage in becoming educated. And millions more by just coming out by just coming out by coming out of by the maternity wards, a guaranteed high quality preschool care if their family needs it. Okay, millions of families who previously struggled to find adequate housing at a price they could afford are now part of a national housing co-op that builds and owns dwelling units and co-housing villages in every American community. Finally, we've succeeded in implementing the, quote, Green New Deal, unquote, transition primarily to zero carbon energy systems and brought carbon emissions close to the stated parameters of the IPCC. In accomplishing all this, we've also established just in time for the massive layoffs of the AI bot revolution, a public enterprise economy that has put millions of Americans back to work by nurturing, restoring, and rebuilding the health and diversity of our natural habitats and ecosystems, as well as designing and building climate adaptive human habitat systems and communities. We have, in short, made great strides toward our collective well being. There is, however, a, quote, problem, unquote. The problem is not that the $110 trillion price tag we'd initially placed on these accomplishments, by the way, compare that to Bernie Sanders' estimate, by far the highest of anyone else's, of 16.2 trillion, anyway, to go on, came in closer to 200 trillion. It may be JD has a more realistic figure or figures. It turns out that the Federal Reserve System was able to produce, for the purposes of public enterprise, 200 trillion in reserves, just as easily as it could have 110 trillion in reserves. The problem we now confront in 2030 is that the 200 trillion has been paid to American citizens and businesses for producing the goods and services just outlined. Um, so, our American families and businesses, in other words, now possess $200 trillion more to spend on food, clothing, housing, automobiles, electronic appliances, labor, and materiel, etc., than they otherwise would have. From many perspectives, this could be viewed as a genuinely good thing. That is, a middle class lifestyle has been extended to a larger percentage of society, and private enterprise is positioned to thrive on that expanded market. But from another perspective, however, there is a big problem, and an even larger conundrum. First, the quote big problem unquote, inflation and hyperinflation. The simple logic of our old world money quote unquote narrative warns us that because of that additional 200 trillion spending power, prices for consumer purchases in 2030 must have dramatically risen to accommodate the extra money. Or viewed from another perspective, the value of the US dollars in everyone's bank accounts must have dramatically fallen. This, in a nutshell, is the predicted problem of price inflation we received dire warnings about a decade ago, back in 2019, when this talk about a new need for public enterprise began. The only previous experience America has had with this dynamic, however, indicates that if properly understood and managed, it is not a threat, but an opportunity. That previous experience was the mobilization of the United States for World War II. During the war, public enterprise expanded, expanded, expanded rather dramatically, employing in one way or another virtually every American citizen. And prices did go up, but were held in check in two ways. A, strict wartime wartime rationing of most consumer goods, and B, payrolls that were partially made with war bonds, i.e., by future dollars. And I guess I need to explain there that JD likes to look at Treasury securities as essentially future dollars, because when the securities fall due and are redeemed by the federal government, they are redeemed by some but some but they are actually redeemed by new dollars created by the Federal Reserve. When the war was over and the future dollars were made real, the sudden increase in consumer purchasing power was absorbed by the dramatic increase in the new production capabilities of private enterprise, capabilities that were built by the public enterprise of the war itself. It would be reasonable to imagine the same dynamic has now unfolded in 2030. All the public enterprise efforts we've just described have resulted in expanded opportunities for private enterprise to offer goods and services for profit. With the expanded, uh, with the a very much expanded middle class market standing ready with all that money they've earned through public enterprise to be the consumers. But maybe not. Maybe, as we were just warned by two economists at the St. Louis branch of the Fed itself, now in 2030, we'd be experiencing hyperinflation, just like, quote, Germany in 1921 to 23, Zimbabwe in 2007 to 2009, and also Venezuela currently, unquote. It's disappointing that in their zeal to discredit the newly emerging modern money perspective, these economists found it prudent not to explain or even point out that in each of these instances of genuine hyperinflation, the root cause was not, quote, printing money, unquote, as they infer that the um, as they infer modern money theory is all about, but something else instead. To say that printing money is the cause of hyperinflation, it turns out, is like saying that flames are the cause of fire. Quote, Germany in 1921 to 23, Zimbabwe in 2007 to 2009, and also Venezuela currently, unquote, all shared the same set of matches and kindling for starting the flames of hyperinflation, namely a virtual total collapse of the production activities of their society. They stopped their producing, or in the case of Venezuela, importing the things that people buy with money. And so naturally, the money that existed and continued to be issued to meet the obligations of the government drove up the prices of the few things remaining on the store shelves. Quick message to the St. Louis Fed from the year 2030. The United States of America hasn't stopped producing things for consumers to buy. There are many more things to buy than in 2019, when the push for public enterprise began. So why should we imagine that we've turned out to be suffering from hyperinflation? In fact, as we now enter the fourth decade of this century, we have a much bigger problem to confront. But we have a conundrum we should have been actively strategizing about much earlier than a decade ago. We actually were trying to strategize about that problem, actually, if I can add a comment, beginning in the 1960s and doing it quite vigorously in the 1970s before the reaction set in, which was motivated, of course, by Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party. The Earth's, quote, carrying capacity, unquote. The conundrum faced by today's modern society is a catch-22 of existential proportions. One, to confront the modern challenges our society faces, public enterprise must step in and pay citizens and businesses massive quantities of currency to undertake by strategic efforts that private enterprise cannot. To avoid serious disruptions from inflation, goods and services for private consumption must expand commensurately with the public enterprise spending. However, we have reached a tipping point where the typical goods and services of private consumption cannot be expanded without exceeding and then collapsing the carrying capacity, quote unquote, of the Earth's natural resources and regenerative systems. The ramifications of this conundrum, this catch 22 of the 21st century, define the ultimate challenge, it seems to me, of modern human society. It appears that something truly magical must occur if we are to go forward with a viable and livable future. We must somehow dramatically expand the goods and services of private consumption, make them available to greater and greater numbers of people, while simultaneously reducing the consumption of finite resources and b restoring and rebuilding the regenerative capacities of the Earth's natural systems and habitats. To imagine there is any other path defies the physics of by reality. Looking down this path, it is certainly not clear how it can be done. What is clear, however, is that the old world the narrative of money, quote unquote, offers us nothing but the prospect of chaos and conflict. As we'll discuss in part 5 to come, the perspective, of modern money theory, however scary or controversial it may seem to mainstream thinkers, offers the very real possibility of hope. So, I'm awaiting JD's part 5, but pending his part 5, I thought I might take the discussion a little further by looking backward to a post of mine that appeared that was a reply. Let me get this clear. This is the blog I used to have as an active blog. It is my knowledge management blog, and the name of it is All Life is Problem Solving. And it is where I first began to blog about MMT back in 2010. In the early months of 2010, I blogged a little about it. And then I joined with a group of other people to form a team that organized the Fiscal Sustainability Conference held at George Washington University on April 28th of 2010. Many of the videos are still available from that particular conference. And you can see them, on YouTube, but I'm not trying to advertise for them here, but just to set the context of what was going on, at that time. There were a number of us who were very active in pushing MMT before there were many people pushing MMT. And we used to have a website called fiscalsustainability.org where we pushed it, and we pushed it at Correnti Wire, as well. Both of these blog sites are now defunct, and you have to get them in the Wayback Machine archives, the Internet Archive. Okay, if you want to look at them. But one of the blogs that originally appeared on my site and that also appeared on Correnti Wire and fiscalsustainability.org was this post, which was entitled um, uh, um, um, uh, actually Modern Money Theory, Social Sustainability, and Nick. And who is Nick? And the blog started off actually with a video. It wasn't a video of mine, it was a video of Nick's. And the video is no longer there because the video was taken down from YouTube in the intervening years. That is why you cannot see it. But I'll go to Clearly now and go through this blog post with you so you can read it too. So I say, okay, in the above video, let me make this a little bit smaller. It turns out I made it too large. There it goes. Okay, so in the video above, Nick, otherwise known as the Modern Mystic, that was a nickname he gave to himself, has raised an important question about applying modern money theory, MMT based economics. He asks whether, if all nations used MMT based economics to achieve full employment, um, um, also truly by universal health care and free public education for everyone, which is, by the way, JD's situation in 2030, at least for the United States, but maybe for the rest of the world too, whether the world wouldn't run up against the resource limits, the carrying capacity of the earth, in other words, and whether these limits, along with competition for resources from everyone, wouldn't cause resource price inflation. Or to put this another way, he is asking whether, even if MMT based, or as he calls it, chartlist economics, is rational at the micro, quote, unquote, at the micro level of the nation, that is the micro level compared to the world level, okay, that Nick was looking, uh, which was his perspective on the problem. It is also rational at the not the macro level, but the sub-macro level of a world system made up of interacting economies, national governments, and interacting sovereign currency, but no world fiscal authority. Or put still another way, is MMT-based economics, which may be fiscally sustainable in the short run in a single nation, both fiscally sustainable and socially sustainable in the longer run in an international system of interacting nations, currencies, and economies. L. Randall Ray, professor of economics at the University at the UMKC, kindly call my attention to Nick's by YouTube in an email, and had this to say in answer to his question. Okay, so by Randy Ray, of course, is no longer a professor at by UMKC. He now has moved on to Bard College, okay, and to the Levy Institute, where he is now a full professor and a principal research fellow or something like that. But in 2010, to quote an email from him, what Randy said was, yes, every sovereign currency country in the world can use its monetary system to achieve full employment of all resources domestically. Most importantly, labor. Yes, if it tries to go beyond full employment, it will drive up domestic resource but prices. Hence, the job guarantee is the best way to get to full employment because it cannot go beyond full employment. In other words, full employment, the JG actually provides a natural limit for full employment. I go on. That is, as I interpret it, the federal job guarantee proposal of MMT Thinkers contains a built in normative constraint on government spending at the full employment level. In addition, since the movement to full employment will increase aggregate demand in the non government sector, jobs created there will move people out of FJG jobs and into those jobs, since the non government sector will need to offer better compensation than is available from JG jobs. As non government sector employment increases and FJG jobs decrease in number, which they would do because people would be moving to the better paying private sector jobs, government spending will also decline, making room for increased non government sector spending without causing inflation. Randy Ray continues about Nick and his views. Quote, his question about exceeding resource constraints exceeding resource constraints by constraints on a global level is legitimate, but what he forgets is that we all have different currencies and we have to go across exchanges. Hence, Zimbabwe cannot pump up its domestic demand so high that it absorbs the resources of the globe. It can buy anything for sale in its own currency, but that does not mean it can buy anything for sale somewhere on earth for some currency or other, because Zimbabwe's access to other currencies is limited and there is not much around the world for sale for Zimbabwe's currency directly. Quote, very large nations like the US and China can indeed run up the prices of the global commodities, and he is right to be concerned about the equity issues involved. However, I am sure he will agree we are a very long way from the global full employment of resources, and rising resource prices will increase the flows anyway, unquote. So now I go on. So Zimbabwe, or any nation, may create aggregate demand sufficient to employ its own population and facilitate its people maximizing their creation of their own real wealth, but generating demand that goes beyond a nation's real wealth and potential to produce further wealth will only result in higher domestic prices, including higher prices in the Zimbabwean currency for the resources it must import from others. So there is a self correcting factor in the system that would make it impossible for any one nation to just create enough of its currency to corner all the resources of the globe. Also, Randley's reply about the legitimacy, of equity issues and the ability of large nations to run up commodity prices, though qualified correctly by the point that we are very far away from global full employment, leaves open Nick's question about whether MMT would be sustainable in the long run if every nation did MMT successfully, I should say, if it applied MMT successfully. So I'll address that and now, and I proceed to address it. All the world's economies and humankind generally faces the problem of scarce, non-renewable natural resources by running out in finite time. The problem is there for MMT, and it is there for any of the competing schools of economics. Joe B. Head, otherwise known as Joe Bongiovanni, a great critic, of MMT, as we found in the years since, another blogger, I refer to him here, who attended the recent Fiscal Sustainability Teach Encounter Conference. That was the MMT conference that we had on April 28th of 2010, emphasizes the point that Nick, in raising the resource and social sustainability questions, isn't pointing to a problem that would be unique to MMT-based economies if these existed, but rather is pointing to a problem that all schools of economics face. Nick might reply to this point by saying, yes, but MMT-based economics makes this problem more acute because its high aggregate demand approach, if followed all over the globe, would result in more and faster consumption of goods using scarce resources than would a world where there were many poor nations and people. This is a serious question, I say, but I think MMT provides a ready answer to it. That answer goes back to one of its central ideas, which is that government spending ought to be in the service of public purposes, or public purpose, as we often say. Government spending, in other words, is for realizing certain valued outcomes like full employment, and universal health care and public no-cost education for all. See, some of us were talking about free college back in 2010 and free pre-K and free everything. But anyway, but that's not all. In a world where natural resources are scarce, running out, and inequitably distributed, it can't be part of the public purpose to get into increasingly serious conflicts with other nations over natural resources. Instead, the economy will have to be reinvented so that its valued outcomes are socially sustainable, both domestically and internationally. And government spending will have to be oriented as much towards realizing resource and social sustainability as it is towards other outcomes. And if all the world's economies implemented MMT principles, all the world's economies would also calculate the worth of the economy, its value for society, in terms of its success in achieving sustainability, as well as its success in realizing other valued outcomes. Nick, the modern mystic, In his assumption that competition among MMT-based economies would necessarily grow competition for scarce resources is making the assumption that MMT-based economies would necessarily involve the production of value outcomes that use more and more of these scarce resources. However, if MMT-based economies are successful, part of the wealth they will produce will be the capability to produce energy from virtually limitless rather than uh, um, 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 scarce resources. For example, of course, solar and wind and hydro. The ability to clean the environment and limit any future environmental damage, and we're starting now, okay, to develop have the ability to take the carbon out of the air and sequester it back into the soil, and even the ability perhaps to clean the plastic out of the oceans. And next, I mentioned the ability to produce goods from recycled materials. And most generally, and we're working on that too, and most generally, the ability to produce wealth using fewer and fewer renewable natural resources. And I say, whether this will uh, whether this will happen or not is problematic. But MMT based, and it's just as problematic in 2019 as it was when I wrote this in 2010. But MMT based economies can make the choice to use government spending to facilitate a transformation to that kind of society rather than to facilitate the kind of growth that is unsustainable. Just a little while ago, my friend and co author Henk Hatters writes from a conference in Paris. Henk is a researcher, actually, uh, who lives in the Netherlands. And he writes from a conference in Paris. He's attending on sustainability and sustainable healthcare systems, as he was attending that in 2010. And he asks whether I or my MMT economist friends might react to the issue of the relationship between money and sustainability. I think I've already done, okay, a little bit of that here, I write. But I'd like to do more by reacting to two questions of his that perhaps but Nick and Randy will be very interested in too. Hank asks via email. Quote, under which conditions can decreasing economic growth in the richer parts of the world be made um, um, being made acceptable? How can well-being still increase while economic growth decreases? How to manage the distribution of income and capital in the broadest sense as man-made, built human and social capital in a society that moves from growth to a steady state, quote unquote. And then quote again from Hank 2. Under which conditions is society under quote steady state unquote conditions able to survive quote unquote without producing even more unemployment, economic crisis, and poverty than under the conditions okay of economic growth unquote. And now I try to answer these questions. I think the concern about limits expressed in these questions is very important. But I also think that the assumption that the need to achieve a steady state in the use, consumption, and renewal of natural resources doesn't necessarily imply declining economic growth. Or to put this another way, economic growth does not equate to growth in the consumption of non-renewable natural resources, or in the too rapid consumption, okay, of natural resources. Since I think both questions are ultimately based on that assumed equating, or at least on a close association between the two, they both beg the question of whether economic well being and sustainability can increase together. I think that is the question we must answer. And also, that the right answer is that it is possible for MMT based economics to provide both of these valued um, um, outcomes. Now, by questioning the connection between growth and growth in the consumption of natural resources, questioning that, I think that that is a critical point. If we look back at the question, okay, of Henk, uh, he says, how can well-being still increase, okay, while economic growth decreases? Well, he's assuming that uh, the condition of growing well-being is not equivalent to an increase, okay, in economic growth. It may be, though, that that is an assumption, okay, which is incorrect. Maybe if the purpose of economics is to produce valued goods and services, and if it's correct to say that valued goods and services are going to produce the well-being of the is going to improve, will produce an increase, okay, in the well-being, okay, of everyone, which is certainly seems to approach what we might mean by public purpose. Then it stands to reason that there's a very close correlation between increase, okay, in economic growth and increase in our well-being. However, since the physical reality is that we're going to uh, have to produce a society which will be a steady state society, okay, in the sense of that our consumption, okay, of scarce resources is going to have to reach, okay, an equilibrium. Okay, then obviously we have to ask the question, or we have to put the point, okay, or arrive at the conclusion that our increase in well-being cannot be based on the production of our material goods insofar as these are based on increasing the consumption of the non-renewable resources. So here we have to move from the economic concepts. We have to distinguish between the economic concepts of goods, okay, and services. Obviously, We can have economic growth in services, and the limits of that kind of economic growth will be based on the limits of our labor and the limits of our inventiveness in thinking of new services that are valued by society, okay, by all of us, to the extent that our ability to invent new services, okay, is unlimited. We can have increased consumption of these services without any ready limits. In other words, we can produce the money necessary to consume the increases in services that we invent and that we create. In other words, we'll have to put a lesser emphasis on valued goods and a greater emphasis on valued services, on new services that we create, okay, as human beings. Those services can greatly expand and can greatly increase in kind without violating the steady state condition that we will eventually have to reach through the Green New Deal and through the development of the advanced society that AOC talks about. Now, going back for a minute to, oops, sorry. I have to get back what I had here. Okay, going back to JD's piece. He actually is posing pretty much the same kind of question. He says, he says again, okay, that the conundrum faced by today's modern society is a catch-22 of existential proportions. He says public enterprise must step in and pay citizens and businesses massive quantities of currency to undertake the strategic efforts that private enterprise cannot undertake. To avoid serious disruptions from inflation, goods and services for private consumption must expand commensurately with the public enterprise spending. But the question I'm raising is, do goods have to expand in such a way that they tax the natural non-renewable resources that we have on the earth? I'm also suggesting that we don't have to worry so much about the expansion, okay, of services. That expansion can be very elastic and can keep up with the expansion in public enterprise spending. So we can consume a lot more in services. And perhaps that can compensate for the fact that our consumption of goods will have to be limited in certain respects. He says again, however, we've reached a tipping point where the typical goods and services of private consumption cannot be expanded without exceeding and then collapsing the carrying capacity of the earth. Yes, That, okay, is very true. But what I'm saying is that it's more like we have reached a tipping point where the typical goods of private consumption cannot be expanded without exceeding and then collapsing the carrying capacity, okay, of the earth. So, okay, it's the goods with respect to which we have to reach a steady state, not so much the services. They can be expanded to the limits that our population can consume. As JD goes on, the ramifications of the conundrum, the catch 22 of the 21st century, define the ultimate challenge, it seems to me, of modern human society. That is the challenge that AOC spoke of. To us, of having to create an advanced society. He says, it appears that something truly magical must occur if we are to go forward with a viable and livable future. And again, he says, we must somehow dramatically expand the goods and services of private consumption. What I'm saying is, I'm not so sure we have to dramatically expand the goods as much as we have to dramatically expand the services. Of course, we have to make the goods available to greater and greater numbers of people, okay, as well. But there can be a limit to this. And the economy can still keep on growing through the growth of services. So I think there's no necessary correlation between declining economic growth and increasing sustainability. That correlation need not exist. We can have increasing sustainability and increasing economic growth because of the elasticity of services. He goes on, while simultaneously reducing the consumption of finite resources and restoring and rebuilding, okay, the regenerative capacities of the Earth's natural systems, okay, and habitats. Okay, yes, okay, but notice what B is dependent upon. How are we going to restore and rebuild the regenerative capacities of the Earth's natural systems? Well, one of the main ways we've been talking about is through regenerative farming, through the right type, okay, of agriculture, through those services getting performed by farmers for the rest of our society. We can then increase to some degree our natural resources by replenishing some of the natural resources we once had through use of our services. Anyway, JD finishes again with looking down this path. It is certainly not clear how it can be done. What is clear, however, is the old world story of money, quote unquote, offers us nothing but the prospect of chaos, okay, and conflict. And to mention something there too, what are we doing in Bolivia now? What have we been doing inside, okay, Venezuela? We have been offering to those countries chaos and conflict. Why? So our companies can exploit their natural resources. And with respect to Bolivia, so our companies can seize their lithium deposits, most of all. That is what the Bolivian coup is about. That is a clear illustration that the old world narrative of money offers us nothing but the prospect of chaos and conflict. Because what is that exploitation about? Get the lithium, get the natural resources, and produce the goods that make us in the private sector money. The money that we in the private sector think is limited to what can be gotten through taxing and borrowing, and through redistributing the money of the poor to the bank accounts of the rich. The old world narrative of money is all about that kind of system. It's all about imperialism. MMT, however, is not about that. It's about public spending for public purpose, where that public purpose includes but producing money to be used in consumption, and also producing money to build sustainability through redirecting consumption to new services that do not absorb and waste our finite resources. And so, I want to leave you with that particular thought. Now, I will move on to your comments, and your questions. I hope you liked that perspective I just gave. If you did, please share, like, and subscribe. Please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I really need your help, of course. Everybody really needs your help. I know everybody's asking me for help. I mean, I watch all the other live streams where people are asking you for help. But still, I ask you for help because I think I'm producing some value here as well. So let me go now to your comments and see what you have to say. Kay says, it all confuses me, laughs out loud. LOL, LOL. Okay, let's see where we are now. Aladdin says, I have a bit of an echo, sorry. I turned down my volume a bit. I hope that takes care of the echo. I'm sorry, Bonnie? Oh, good, thanks. And Dolores has joined. Hey, Dolores. And Russ Goldman has joined. Cheyenne has joined. Happy solstice. Yeah, happy solstice. Hasn't the solstice already happened? Cheyenne said, which fairy tale was that? And Nancy Blackmore has joined, and Kay has joined. I've tried to figure this MMT out, but still can't quite figure it out. Okay? Please feel free to ask me questions. I think I qualify as an MMT expert, having written seven ebooks that are about MMT, okay, and its applications. Now, you don't hear too much, okay, about my books, okay, because I'm not among the original developers, okay, of MMT. I'm a Joe come lately as of 2010, but still I've been writing and talking about MMT for 10 years now and doing a lot of writing in the area. So I think I know, okay, an awful lot about it. Kay says, if they're going to continue printing money, that money should go for the public good instead of backing the big banks, in my opinion. Kay, we completely agree with you. Most of the MMT folks completely agree with you. What we say is that economics should be practiced for the public purpose. The public good, of course, is part of the public purpose. And there are very few of us who are behind the idea of backing the big banks. I think most of the MMT economists would probably say that uh, it would not be a bad idea that when the big banks but fail again, the best way to handle it might simply be to nationalize them and simply reconstitute them as public banks. And by the way, there are many of us who would advocate for full nationalization of the Federal Reserve. Not that that's a first priority, okay, or an overwhelming priority, because the system as it is now can probably be made to work. But it would be a lot simpler if the Federal Reserve banks were within the Treasury Department. Rich Serber has joined. Hi, Rich. How are you doing? And Rob Rivera has joined. Hey, Rob. And Randy Hedgebeth has joined. Hi, Randy. Rob says, hey, Yoda. And Rob, I got a question about sovereign governments who issue their own currency but also have debt denominated in a foreign currency. Why does their currency to purchase goods well, actually, I covered that here, Rob. I don't know if you were here for it, but the point is to buy goods from other places, you have to have a currency that other nations are willing to trade it. So, for example, for the United States, when we buy foreign goods, we pay for them, okay, in our dollars. But when Zimbabwe tried to import goods in the period 2007 to 2009, they soon ran out of the capacity to buy those goods because their currency on the international exchanges was worthless compared to other currencies. In other words, the value of everyone's currency floats on the international exchange if the government is floating, okay, its particular currency. Now, there are some nations that don't actually float their currency, but they peg their currency to another currency. For example, China's currency, the yuan, okay, is pegged to the dollar. It tries to keep, okay, a ratio, a constant. And when the market starts to disturb that particular ratio, it takes some of its currency off the international market in order to maintain the preset ratio, okay, that it is fixed at. Now, China can do that because it has accumulated a store, okay, of dollars that it can use to buy back, okay, its own currency. Okay, and so in that way, it strengthens on its currency by using the dollars it has accumulated through its exports. Okay. However, if countries are not producing exports, okay, remember Zimbabwe had a problem. The political revolution there and the expropriation of the farms created a situation where the new owners of the farms didn't have the expertise to produce the agricultural goods, okay, of Zimbabwe, which it mainly traded in the same quantity as the farmers who got expropriated had. So Zimbabwe, for a while, destroyed their productive capacity to agriculture and could no longer export the agriculture necessary to get the foreign exchange they needed to keep their currency strong. On the other hand, if they allowed their currency to float and they were trying to buy a lot of foreign goods without having any exports themselves, then that currency would be quickly devalued, which is what happened actually to Zimbabwe. Once their currency was quickly devalued, they weren't able to import the things they needed to import to keep the exports they did have going. So the whole thing was a downward spiral and led to the crash of the economy in spite of the government printing more and more and more money. It purchased less and less because the productive capacity was not there, so the money was competing for decreasing real goods and services. So I hope this explains it to you, but that's what happens. Okay? When you have debt in a foreign currency, then you cannot control whether you're going to be able to repay that particular debt. If your currency in foreign trading falls, okay, in value, let's say it falls by 100 to 1 or something like that, then you have to use 100 times the foreign exchange that you planned on in order to pay back your debt. Okay, when Germany, between 1921 and 1923, when Weimar Germany got into its hyperinflation, that in part was caused by the fact that its war debt, which was in enormous amounts, the payment in war debt amounted to something like a third to a half, okay, of its economy. It had to pay back that debt in foreign currency, in hard currency, in gold, okay, or in English pounds, okay, or in dollars, in currency that relative to the value, okay, of the Reichsmark at that time was hard currency. Germany wasn't able to print the hard currency. All it could print and create, okay, was the Reichsmark. So to buy the foreign currency, it had to use more and more and more and more of the Reichsmarks. And so therefore, its own currency's value in the international exchange fell to nearly zero. And domestically, it fell to nearly zero as well. Because insofar as the production of domestic goods was based, okay, on international trade, and the world, okay, is very interdependent, okay, in these days. And so what's going on in foreign exchange has a great effect, okay, on your country, okay, on your internal markets. Then you get into that situation of hyper inflation, not only in international trade, but also domestically. And Rob asks, sovereign currency is issuing and taxing in their currency. So what is making their currency so cheap? Okay? What is making their currency so cheap is because the currency has smaller and smaller value on the international markets. Yes, is it because their currency is pegged, okay, or semi-pegged? In part, okay, it is. Okay, in other words, if your currency is pegged to a foreign currency, okay, it's basically Germany's currency, okay, at that time. Uh, they tried to peg it to the hard currencies, but they weren't able to maintain the peg. So their currency started to float. And since they were printing more and more and more, okay, of their currency, its value on the international exchanges became less and less and less. So, okay, it's because your currency is pegged, but the solution to that is not simply to allow your currency to float, because if you allow your currency to float and you're not exporting, okay, you're not exporting and not getting any foreign exchange, so that you're not able to import the things that you need, then the value of your currency is still going to go down and down and down and down, and you won't be able to get the foreign goods that you need to keep your industry going, okay, and your productivity going. That is what happened to Weimar Germany, or that is part of what happened to Weimar Germany. It's what happened to Zimbabwe, and it's what has been happening to Venezuela. Specifically, with regard to Venezuela, most of its exports were in oil. But the Saudis decided to collapse the price of oil. They decided to play cutthroat. This might have been due to collaboration with the foreign policy of the United States. I don't know. But, they decided they wanted to put a lot of the other oil producers out of business. And the price of oil went from something like, I don't know, what was it, $110, $120 a barrel, and it went down to $30 a barrel. This meant that the exports, okay, of Venezuela in a very short time were devalued. And they were getting their foreign exchange from their exports, okay, of oil. So suddenly their foreign exchange was cut off. And this was also helped by the economic sanctions, okay, of the U.S. against them, because the U.S. was pressuring other countries not to trade in Venezuelan oil. So Venezuela then was not able to maintain anything like the dollar peg that it had to maintain in order to be able to import the goods that it needed to import. That's why it's having such a tough time, okay, with its economy. Back in 2010, this situation did not exist. Okay, Venezuela was doing fine, and the economy was getting actually rapidly modernized. But the collapse of the oil market really put a stop to that. When I used to teach my seminars, okay, in knowledge management for industry, in the early 2000s, I got some people from the state oil company, okay, in Venezuela, coming over to take my knowledge management seminars. They could afford to do that then because there was no problem with their getting dollars. They had the oil, they were able to export the oil. They were doing very well relative to the dollar. They could afford to send people here to study. There were no sanctions against them, okay, at that time. We contented ourselves with trying to overthrow Chavez, okay, with coups and such, okay, and we didn't apply any economic sanctions. Of course, in the last uh, 6 years or so, that has really greatly changed. Okay. If the currency, okay, is floating and you don't have exports by yourself, so you're actually not accumulating any foreign currency, then when the value of your floating currency goes down, you won't have any foreign exchange but to trade with. In other words, because your currency goes down, okay, in value, the people from other nations are less willing to allow you to import by using your currency. They call for payments in foreign currencies that you don't issue, okay, and you don't control. That's when it's very important that you have the dollar reserves or you have pound reserves or Swiss francs to trade in. That's when it becomes extremely important when you have a relatively a great amount of foreign currency to trade in. So, Rob, I asked because I had a case study question as my last assignment, my international finance class, where we were being hired to advise. It's the central bank, the Malaysian central bank. I, of course, made an MMT argument. Arnie was my president made a comment where he said that governments don't control their currency because if they did, then they would essentially control the economy, and we don't have that. I just rolled my eyes and asked myself, if they didn't control their currency, then U.S. dollars, in our case, okay, would never exist. Well, they might exist, but we might be in a situation similar to Venezuela, okay. Okay, to control the value of your currency, you have to be able to issue it. You have to be able, okay, to allow it to float, and you have to be able to pay your debts. to other nations. Now, if those debts are in your own currency, they're always very easy to pay, and then you control your economy. The problem comes when foreign traders won't accept your currency anymore, and they give you credit, but only in foreign currencies. Then you have to accumulate the foreign currencies to pay them back. Well, what I advise you do is to go to new economic but, but, to the new economic perspectives blog, Rob. And if you go to that blog, I'm going to change my view here and show you something. If you go to that blog, you look at the top of the page. You'll see the MMT primer on the top of the page. Click on that. Okay, so I think the original draft chapters, okay, of the primer are still here, okay, and some of the chapters deal with foreign trade. You might want to read the chapter on what is a sovereign currency and what backs up currency and why would anyone accept it. And also the discussion, okay, of exchange rate regimes. Okay, so you can click, okay, on all these things. And Randy has a very good discussion of alternative exchange rate operations. So he talks about fixed exchange rates and the gold standard, and also floating exchange rates. Okay. Okay, so you can click on that and you can still read it. Okay, and if you have the money, I strongly recommend his book. I have a Kindle ebook version. It's a great book. And it's well worth the money to buy it. But if you can't buy it, then go to the MMT Primer at NEP and look up the appropriate chapters, and you'll get all you need for your paper. Okay? So there's your answer. I hope I've started you down the road to understanding that. Okay, back to your comments now. Okay, says it all confuses me, laugh out loud. So you can now advise the central bank. Kay says, it all confuses me, laugh out loud. Lana says, sorry for my delayed response. I'm not at my desk. Russ says, still have an echo here. Jim Rushford has joined. Kay says, I like the idea of a true public bank, but not many of them. If they all go public, it will be too hard to regulate them, Kay, in my opinion. I think if the banks are public banks, it'll be easier to regulate them. And Kay says, oh, one of the Dakotas has a state bank. Yeah, right, Kay. It's North Dakota. I've heard it works extremely well for them. Investments in local and stays consistent. Yeah, it's a very, very good bank. Uh, the person who has written most about the Bank, okay, of North Dakota is I will think of it. I actually correspond with her occasionally. Okay, I'll reply to your comment to your K, and I'll give you the link. Russ says, I've got a call in the night, have to work tomorrow and do some running. Thanks for coming, Russ. Nice to see you here. Rob says he was saying that the impossible trinity can never happen. What's the impossible trinity? Okay, that can never happen. You can have a nation that has a floating exchange rate that issues its own currency and that has no debt in a foreign currency. This is not an impossible trinity. In fact, it's the situation for the United States actually right now. So, okay, I hate to tell your professor, but that's the situation in the United States right now. It's the situation for a number of countries. It's the situation uh, in the UK as well. It's the situation for Australia, for New Zealand, okay, for Japan. Kay says, well, Joe, need to say good night. Laugh out loud. I love a discussion, although I'm still confused about MMT. Laugh out loud. Hope to see you tomorrow night. If you are here, night all. I'm not sure I'll be here tomorrow night. I got to think about it. I may be here in the afternoon instead. Uh, and Rob says, okay, Yoda, I'll start reading what you suggested. I have to go now. Good night. And Rob thanked me. Okay, any other comments or questions? not, I'm about to call it a night. Thanks for coming. I see there's still a few of you who are hanging in here. Thanks for coming. I'll probably see you sometime tomorrow. I'm not sure when. And the same goes, of course, for Christmas Day. But I'll certainly be back on Thursday. So thanks for coming. There'll be a lot of good stuff on Thursday to talk about. Good night.